Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here, and this topic is something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. I've been talking with many of my colleagues and friends for years. However, it was only until recently when I began to dig a little deeper, and I'd like to thank the Roll Collective in their new publications and talking about the idea of thinking about the native speaker ideologies. I have felt, and I still feel, it is a professional taboo to look at or problematize the concept of deaf native, quote unquote, signer ideologies in linguistics research. And I'll explain why. Sorry, someone said that they couldn't see my signing. Okay, thank you for that. All right, I will try my best to keep it focused. So if you work with deaf people in some professional capacity, you know that we talk about, on average, in most societies, probably around 95% of deaf people are born to hearing families. And the statistics will range from 90 to 98%, but I'm going to say 95%. And what that means is that 5% remains of those deaf born to deaf families. So one way to envision this is when we think about the population, the general population of deaf people, is to think about deaf people and hearing families as though we were thinking about city doves or pigeons, the common birds that you see every day. And people are kind of annoyed by those pigeons. They harass us sometimes. That 5%, if you will, you could envision them as a rare bird. For example, a blue-eyed ground dove. Yes, a dove with blue eyes. It is something that we don't see every day, hard to find, and very few in number. So the idea that the dove with the blue eyes is in the middle or center of my figure here, and we think about all the pigeons around them, similar to deaf people. So it's not a perfect example, but deaf people are a rare bird when they are deaf of deaf parents. It's not that they are endangered, but the distribution or the heredity of deafness in certain families in our population is very small. Looking at the research, there are different ways of looking at how deaf people. Here's a visualization, a representation of how deaf people tend to be conceptualized as a population, where the 5% are overrepresented as native signer. And I've chosen this when we talk about the 95%. Rather, we talk about the 5% of native signers and the 95% presented as non-native signers. This looks at that not all the 95 are signers. Some of them identify as different, but they are non-native signers. They are born to hearing families, and they are more widespread, kind of like a mule, if you will, or donkey rather, because it's easy to find donkeys in this 95%. But when you think about other people, those deaf of deaf, they might be the unicorn or the native signers. So how do deaf people conceptualize themselves in relation to signing profiles? In a society example, for example, here in the United States, do they identify as native signers, fluent signers, L1, L2, etc.? I'm making an educated guess in my personal experience and talking with other people, and I am choosing the different types of birds. As I mentioned, you can see the birds are distributed over the green circle. But not all deaf people share the same concept of what a native signer is in the form of how we use it linguistically. So we can think about native as more about proficiency. People can talk, they can tell stories, they're fluent. We can talk about access to ASL or other sign languages. Can they access them visually? Is it their first language? Is it their native language? How do they identify themselves? So those are deaf people often viewing native as proficiency or access or even both, but it's not really about the age of exposure, whether the family is deaf or not. And so to summarize, clearly we see a disconnect or a mismatch in our ideologies about deaf signers from the view of linguistics, language ideologies, of deaf native and non-native signers. So there are a few problems with language ideologies. Let's talk about a few. Talk about ideologies based on an elusive or inconsistent definition of criteria. Who is the native signer and who is not? Second, the boundary lumps all native signers into a group, that 95%. But that kind of erases the rich heterogeneity of deaf signers' language experiences. Third, because the deaf people are lumped into two broad groups, native and non-native, these labels themselves are persistent and perpetuate this broad deficit and perspectives towards non-native signers, positioning them as others. We see them as others who lack the native competence. And all of these ideologies have profound implications of the research. So we think about research and beyond and what that means. If you don't work in sign language research, you've probably seen some books that have pictures of deaf signers. Most are ASL, there's a few Hebrew Sign Languages or other languages. So the face of a native signer is appeared in some of these textbooks. They tend to be white passing, light skin, etc. For us who work in sign language research, we know who they are. We know their names, we know their family members, we know where they grew up, which schools they've been to, where they graduated from, et cetera, et cetera. In addition, if you pick any of those books up, you flip through them, you will see some photos or prints of pictures where, again, most, if not all the people in there are white passing, or light skin. Visual representations of signers are racially homogeneous. And we talk about competent communicative competence. We talk about sociolinguistics in how white and Black signers view people differently, or the judgment of what is considered ASL and what is not considered ASL is something that people believe to have a judgment within. So when we talk about native signers, we need to flesh this out a little bit. Before I unpack this label, I want to give you some background that the field is quite young compared to the broader linguistic field talking about language and all that's involved. So when we analyze ASL, started in the 1960s, we began to look at it as a language, and then the field took off. In the 1970s with psycholinguistic research, it began to have more people interested in the language. We're looking at ASL as a natural language. People who have deaf parents are seen as these natives because the children were exposed from birth to acquire this language, and they follow the same timeline and milestones as those hearing children of hearing parents. For example, English, those children who are born to English-speaking parents are the same. And so they have the milestones, and in psycholinguistics, we see that the human brain looks at sign language as a real language, just like spoken language, not something different or unique. Sign language isn't a gestural form of communication or a pantomime with someone trying to get out of a box. So that means that deaf native signers and their knowledge and use of ASL is key for understanding and maintaining sign language linguistics as a scholarly field. It's very instrumental, and ASL was instrumental in establishing this. And so these signers have been looked at. We have interpreters and we have other people in the field, in adjacent fields, that look at this. It's important to recognize that they show that children who are deaf and maybe don't have early access to sign language can and do experience language deprivation. It's a serious public health issue. I do think that we can pay attention to language deprivation and the seriousness of it. People need to be aware how serious it is. At the same time, we need to unpack and investigate and criticize the native language ideologies that we have had for so long. Native signers and that phrase has an interesting origin. So we may have borrowed it from the concept of the phrase native speaker. You who have watched the talks before know that native speaker refers to an idea of perfection, a monolingual speaker, a listener, a person who knows the standard of that language, a person who grew up with other people using the same language with the correct pronunciation. Can I pause for a moment? I'm seeing a lot of chat and I can't figure out how to open it. Oh, it's just comments. Okay, you see me fine. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that everyone can see me okay. Thank you so much for your comments. All right. So yes, so the concept of native speaker seems to fit with Chomsky's frame of communicative competence. That's separate from performance. And of course, at the same time, native speaker and native signer are not a perfect example. We tend not to see any monolingual signers that exist. They live in a high contact area of society. They write, they read, they know other sign languages as well. And so that means deaf people, I think, we do and should be consider ourselves multilingual. And perhaps linguists, hopefully, look at us as multilingual as well. But the question then remains, who do linguists consider deaf native signers? And who are they? We can begin to start some of these answers by looking at, well, I looked at a lit review, a small one. I looked at articles and books, PhD publications, dissertations, books that introduce sign language linguistics. And altogether, there have been about 30 years of the lit review that I looked at, and most of them range from areas of specialization, vary sign language, not limited to American Sign Language. And of course, ASL is probably the most studied sign language. We tend to see more publications about ASL than other sign languages. An example that I just saw, an article in the Journal of Child Language, JDL, published about ASL, really talked about the sign language of other sign languages. It really trumped it because there are so many studies in ASL. So we have the psycholinguistics, we have first language acquisition, psycholinguistics, we have language documentation, descriptions, also within corpora studies, And one part of the grammar that is explained in sign languages also exists. So, and then lastly, we have the sociolinguistics. So there's a lot of variation in defining what the criteria is of native deaf signers. I know that the variation exists, but to document what reports are, who is and who is not clear. On the surface, the definition of what or who, rather, is a deaf native signer will be explained in some, but in the lit review that I saw, many don't use the phrase native signer. And I think it either is avoided or it isn't mentioned because perhaps the pattern of language use isn't the same. One article I saw actually measured deaf ASL signers with eye movement for reading English. Other articles and researchers do very small populations of deaf signers in a particular place or area with no deaf family members there. And so the researcher happens to just work with whoever's there in the area in which they live or work. But altogether, all the publications have so many different amounts of information depending on the research question, the area of specialty. And so I tried my best to summarize the general scenario or the general feel for what is here. And looking at the definitions of native signer, in almost every publication, you'll see native signer if they're exposed to sign from deaf parents at birth. Other researchers will expand and say the definition may include children who learned ASL or other sign language by age of 3 or prior to the age of 3. So the age of exposure. Other has to do with the family. Are the parents deaf or hearing or a mixture? That part of the definition wasn't clear. There was a few places that said they were born hearing and they could be a native signer if they learned sign prior to the age of 2 or 3, or if they had older deaf siblings. I'll emphasize on that because they would learn sign from that person. But at the same time, for these deaf with older siblings, other publications would label those people as near native signers or early signers. And I have seen either of those phrases referring to different things as well. One publication I found to be very interesting talked about deaf signers learning ASL from hearing parents because they had deaf parents. So their hearing parents had deaf parents. Are they considered native? In many ways they were. And then another publication specifically said deaf native signer, 3rd generation, because they got the native input from their deaf parents who got them from their deaf parents. And then the context of use. When we look at deaf adults and we look at children, how they are exposed to ASL or other sign languages early, and if they use ASL or that sign language in every day, particularly in at least a minimum of 10 years, as that relates to the length of the language experience. Like I said, minimum of 10 years, and it happens through daily contact with deaf community members as they interact in sign language every day. So I saw that in most of the publications. And those are the 4 that I looked into, and we can see other demographic information. Certain ones talk about variables like how old they are when they participated in the study. They'll write that down. For example, they have to be at least 18, up to 65. Often, some studies would identify the gender of the person. I see those 2 pretty regularly, whereas others less so documented the demographics, depending on the publication itself, where the deaf people were from. And what's interesting about that is the number of labs that focus on sign language research, specifically a few universities around the United States, I often saw a few places where the same publication would be San Diego. Why? Well, we have a lab that focuses on sign language research in San Diego. So a lot of attention for deaf people in the San Diego greater area is there. And then Austin, Texas. Not surprising, again, because a huge deaf community, deaf school, and what have you. There are people there who work there who sign, people who work in other places who will fly to Texas to get data. Washington, D.C. is another hub. Boston is another place. So we'll see expectations to find big deaf communities in some of these places where people do research, and they also tend to be strong white areas or participants. So when we talk about origin of region, we measure the variation in sign language, Northeast, West, South, etc. Schooling, some publications will mention which deaf school the deaf participants attended or graduated. That relates to the variety as well. Researchers will know if they know which school they went into, kind of determining some things about them. And then the socioeconomic status, or SES, of deaf people and or their parents. Do they have a BA? Do they have a PhD? What's the education level? What about their families' education level or SES, their income and education? Now, race and ethnicity. I'll lump the two categories together because the lit review that I did, if the publication didn't focus on Black ASL or didn't focus on lexical variation in one deaf community, that meant that the publication didn't say anything about race or ethnicity of the signers at all. Except for the sociolinguistics. There are very old publications about language acquisition that do notate deaf children are white. But again, this is old from 1980s, 70s. And deaf children are white. Few have quote unquote Asian heritage, whatever that means. And all the rest, other than a small number, mentioned it. So publications tend to have this assumption that people are white. And you can see the pictures of white or white passing or light skin signing models if they have any. The type of information about race isn't necessarily given explicitly. Sometimes they talk about the signer, but you get the impression that if we don't know who they are related to race, our assumption is the default is that they are white. Maybe the visual representation of the signer is as such. So that means, why don't we see more representation of deaf people of color as signers, native, however we define them, in linguistics? Well, one answer would be a quote from John Henner and Octavian Robinson. These two researchers researched the fact that we don't work to invest to look for non-white native signers. In addition to that, I just saw Dr. Joseph Hill lecture recently. He said that back in the day, we have an assumption in research that there were no Black deaf families out there, and therefore there's no Black deaf native signers. That kind of assumption led us to focus on white deaf people to study. I wanted to add that language ideologies about deaf signers involves ideologies about sign variety or signing practice. Which signing varieties is important to some? So if we think about or conceptualize signing varieties, is it a full-fledged system in a deaf community? Or is it not a fully developed system? Maybe it's a home sign. Do we ignore them and just look at the idea of native signer, meaning it has to be from a full-fledged system, not a home signer, like a small side language, if you will? A good example, many people are aware of Stokoe in his, he's a scholar who published first linguistic analysis of ASL. He helped to create the distribution of sign language in America. And then we have Tervoits, also published linguistic research, formative linguistic analysis of signing from the past, and what we would consider the beginning of sign language linguistics. Signs that were created in school, but still are not in the normal way of creating them naturally within the community. Social status is also important. Which ASL variety do we tend to cherish or privilege more? For example, white ASL or black ASL in the United States. Linguists are aware that black ASL has existed for many years. Deaf people know it as well, but many don't talk about it for political reasons or other reasons. They focus on white ASL because it's considered more prestigious or more useful or more used or more mainstream. Limited to those in deaf schools, those perhaps in the South are ignored because of the way in which they sign, and they focus on other people. Until very recent, they have focused on those in the Southern area regarding varieties. People in sign language research are familiar with many different categories. We love categories as linguists, don't we? So we have assigned systems. We have ASL as a language. We have MCE, which is manually coded English. It is an umbrella term for different types of made up or other sign languages that are not full-fledged. People use them to teach kids in school who are deaf to try to improve their English. And we have contact sign, which is the range of linguistic categories, starting with language and moving over to systems. We have different characteristics and features in these systems and the language. So some communities view their sign variety differently, but the categorization introduces something a little bit different. So often we'll use different terms, ASL, SEE, contact sign, or PSE, meaning Pidgin Signed English, describing different types of signing behavior. And if you remember, ASL is a new name for us in our language use before the 1980s. We didn't call it ASL. So the introduction of linguistics ideologies about different types of signing influences deaf communities and how they think about their signing behavior. And I think this is the interesting perspective about sign varieties and how it's changed with the introduction of signing categories, if you will, or varieties. And so looking at social status, are we throwing the native signer, instead of using the term more inclusively, do we need to be, are we throwing it in the trash? Should we revise native signer, not limited to that 95%? Can it include some people, interpreter error, from the 5% to the 95%? Can we look at the input and the variety in the world in which people use American Sign Language? And talk about the definition of native signer. What do we cherish? What do we value? We need to think about these questions. Which knowledges and experiences are privileged at the expense of other knowledges and experiences? What assumptions or theories do we adopt when we apply it to a linguistic analysis about native signers or about deaf signers, and why? And then lastly, how do we minimize this perpetuation of deaf signers to fit linguistic views of native signers? And how do we frame others and change that framing, not to frame them as others and to dismiss them, but to bring them more into the center? There's a new sign language linguist textbook that's just been published, and I think maybe the only sign language linguistic textbook that I've seen in a long time that is critical of the concept of native signer. So this is really exciting. We, I think, should be doing things differently from now on. Perhaps avoid these broad generalizations. Other actions that we can do, we should be asking more inclusive research questions, valuing the white deaf native signer, but moving that to the side and making more space for those who are not white. We should also consider expanding, diversifying our research recruitment. We should be getting participants who are deaf, who identify themselves differently, how they self-identify, how they use sign language, how often, maybe a self-rating proficiency, their schooling, their background, and then also more demographic variables for race and ethnicity of these participants. Yes, great textbook. I saw the chat. So in closing, I would just show a beautiful picture of all of the birds in one picture, no external people, and including everyone. And thank you so much for your time.